Hey guys, welcome back to the Compass Games Learn to Play series. Today we welcome back designer John Southard, and he's going to go into really good detail about both the gameplay and the historical background for his latest design, Carrier Battle Philippine Sea. So without further ado, over to you, John.
Welcome. This is a Learn to Play for Carrier Battle Philippine Sea, published by Compass Games. I'm John Southard, the designer. It was a privilege to work on this project with Compass and the great team we had. This is a solitaire simulation of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. You are fighting as the U.S. Admiral controlling the U.S. forces against the Japanese. The Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred in June of 1944 alongside the invasion of the Mariana Islands, which you see here at the right side of the map. It was occurring at the same time as the land fighting on the island of Saipan. And this was the largest carrier battle ever fought in history by far. In fact, there are more flight decks and more aircraft involved in this battle on the U.S. side than in all the carrier battles of 1942 put together. It also shows the U.S. Navy at its true peak as far as its practice of naval aviation. And it was a very decisive battle of war. It was the last time the Japanese Navy came out seeking decisive battle with the United States, thinking that they could win, making an effort to destroy the U.S. fleet. As a result of their defeat in this battle, they switched over more to suicide tactics, which they used for the rest of the war. So this game is based on a old game, Carrier by Victory Games, published decades ago. It has many of the same concepts, many of the same mechanics, but we've made a lot of improvements as well, and a lot of changes to fit this topic and this time period, because carrier aviation as practiced in 1944 was very different from 1942. But as in the previous game, the core concept is that you're the U.S. Admiral. You see only what the U.S. Admiral would have seen. You do not know where the Japanese are or even what their order of battle is, and these things are revealed to you in the course of play. So let me just give you a tour of the game components here. We've already found the Mariana Islands here. And the central piece that you have to fight with at the beginning of the game is right there, Task Force 58, which was a massive fleet by this time. The actual ships of Task Force 58, as well as their aircraft when they're on board the ships, are over here on the right side of the map on these four task groups displays. Task Force 58 consisted of 4 carrier task groups, each one with 3 or 4 aircraft carriers, and then a task group of surface ships as well, Task Group 58.7. I've only partially set up these displays here because I'm going to use this Learn to Play to teach you some of the basic mechanics of the game, teach you all the game's major subsystems. We are not actually going to play through a turn, though, because there is a comprehensive example as part of the rule book. So if you want to see a whole turn in progress, I refer you to that example, which has a lot of good detail in it. Anyway, here are the task group displays. You have spaces here for the individual carriers with their aircraft in different states of readiness. We'll talk lots more about that. Ships in the screen can be placed there when they need to be, which is when Japanese strikes actually attack. And then here at the upper right of the map, we have the air mission displays, which, as you will discover, we spend a lot of time with. This is where United States aircraft are placed when they are in air missions, either to intercept or to strike. And these tracks here, the numbered tracks, are for keeping track of fuel. Very prominent here on the displays because fuel was a huge issue for the U.S. aircraft in this battle. So that's why you have to keep track of it in that way. Now, as for the map itself, it's mostly open ocean, but there are some interesting things on it. And I'll just zoom in just a little bit here so you can see these more closely. There we go. Okay, that'll do. So these numbered circles here with the rising sun insignia on them, and I'm so grateful to Bruce Yerian for the amazing job he did on all the art for this game. These are arrival hexes, and these are places that Japanese forces may arrive during the game. We'll talk exactly about what a force is in just a minute. And the aircraft carriers here with the numbers are what are called mission movement compasses, and they control the Japanese naval movement in the early stage of the game before the Japanese are reacting tactically to Task Force 58 or other American forces. So the Japanese initially move in accordance with a concept of mission and objective that they have, but then as they engage the U.S., they move more tactically. Now, as I mentioned, there's a great deal of asymmetry in how the naval and air units of the two sides are represented, in keeping with the idea that you are the U.S. Admiral, so you know all the specifics of what's going on with the United States. If you look at the air units down here, you see you have air units which represent specific types of aircraft. Each one represents about 12 aircraft. This is an F-6F, the Hellcat, which was a decisive weapon in this particular battle. Then you've got some others here, the TBF and TBM, which are the same plane, basically just made by different manufacturers. The SB-2 Sea Dive bomber, and also some SBDs still in service on some of the other ships. So you know all this very specifically, and you also know exactly what ships you have right from the get-go. Not so, however, with the Japanese. Japanese are represented by these amorphous force counters, which represent the possible presence of ships. And the presence of a number of these force counters and their arrival randomly in the game represents the aggregate effect of the different sources of intelligence that you have, that the US had. So all you know is that there might be something here. This might be a force of carriers, it might be a force of surface ships, it might be nothing at all. You need to send out search planes and find out. Or you can wait until it attacks you, and then you'll find out that way. Likewise, the Japanese aircraft are not represented by specific aircraft types. They're simply represented as air points, naval or land air points. The naval forces as well are represented more by their aggregate pieces, the cruiser forces and destroyer forces. There are some capital ships, the aircraft carriers and the battleships, but below that level, you don't really get individual names of Japanese ships. So what these force counters represent, as I said, is it's determined as play proceeds in a way that is consistent with your actions, search or attack, and also with the game's actions, meaning that they attack you. And we'll learn more about how that works as we go on. Now, I've started here with 6 force counters already deployed on the map, just to speed the setup a little bit. In actual fact, that is done during the play. So the game begins with just the one piece, Task Force 58, just the one surface piece, and then the U.S. submarines. There are 5 U.S. submarines which are represented in the game. And they are there because in the actual battle, they were very important. 2 of the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers that were sunk at this battle were sunk by U.S. submarines, so it was a good day for U.S. submarines. Your control of them, however, is a little bit limited, and that represents the fact that these submarines didn't actually report to the commander of Task Force 58. They were being controlled from Pearl Harbor, and of course, there was some cooperation that was going on, but communication delays were very significant and messages would get garbled and so forth. So I wanted to mention that just because some people get a little confused as to why they don't seem to have full directorial control and full information coming from the submarines. And that's the reason, because Admiral Mitcher, who was in charge of Task Force 58, didn't have it, and neither did Admiral Spruance, who was in overall charge of all American forces in this operation. Now, an important concept related to the forces is called intelligence levels. And every force is always at an intelligence level, which is numbered from 0 to 4. So you have level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And those are in increasing order of specificity. So level 0, as I said, that's what they are now. They're level 0 when they arrive in play. That means you know absolutely nothing. There could be 6 carriers there. There could be nothing at all. As you contact the force or as it attacks you, you will find out more and more and more, to the point where if you actually get strike planes over it, or if you search it enough times, you will find out exactly what's there, at least in terms of the number of carriers and roughly the surface ship makeup, and that's level 4. So a big part of the game is figuring out what the Japanese have and where it is, and trying to get more and more information about the different forces, but making decisions given the limited information that you have. Now, the rules for the game are organized in something called programmed learning, which means that you read a certain number of sections of the rules and then play a learning scenario. The first learning scenario, you just have to read a few pages of rules and it will teach you how to do air-to-air combat. Each of these scenarios, each of these learning scenarios is some piece of the actual battle, something taken from the actual battle. So you can learn a little about the history of the battle at the same time as you're learning the game. There are 5 learning scenarios in all. The 5th learning scenario, kind of a capstone, is that you get to play most of the second day when the Americans were going after the Japanese and trying to strike them. And it culminated in the famous airstrike flown at sunset to attack the Japanese fleet. There is a separate training scenario, the second training scenario, in which you fly just that strike. And when you fly it, you'll be surprised, as some of the buyers of the game have, at how remarkable and how desperate this strike actually was. You actually play it in the game and you realize, oh my goodness, the guys who flew this strike were heroes, absolutely, just to get in the planes and fly the strike, never mind the fact that they had to face enemy bullets while doing it. It was truly a very remarkable operation of war. I am not trying to supplant any of that in what I'm doing here. I earnestly hope that you will read each section of rules and play the examples in sequence, and also study the comprehensive example that we have given you in the playbook. That's about 10, 12 pages, and it's several turns of play, a complete example of the standard scenario covering the first day of the battle. So you'll get an idea of how all pieces of the game work together. But as a result of what we're going to do here, you will have a head start on all of that, because I'll be teaching you here most of the basic systems of the game. So just to initially give you the structure, let's talk a little bit about the sequence of play. And by that, I mean the full sequence of play, the one that's used in the standard scenarios. I should mention, by the way, there are 4 standard scenarios representing the first and second day, and then a couple of hypothetical scenarios as well. We'll talk more about that later. So in the full sequence of play, each full game turn represents 80 minutes, and a game turn consists of 4 action phases, each one of which represents 20 minutes. And there is a play aid, a basically game turn play aid that allows you to keep track of exactly which phase and segment you are on. That play aid is your friend, because there's a lot of different steps to it, a lot of phases, a lot of segments, and it's important that you do them in the right order. The order of the play is very specific. There's a marker included that you can use to mark your place, so you can leave the game even in the middle of a turn and come back just fine with nothing lost. If you need to leave the table or whatever, you can come back and pick up right where you were, wherever you were. If you have a few minutes here or there, you can do one segment and then come back and pick it up at the next segment. The naval forces in the game basically do things on the turn cycle. So once per 80-minute turn, each of these naval forces, Task Force 58 and the Japanese naval forces, move. And then also once per turn, you check whether the Japanese forces launch an air raid. And all of that is done in a chit-driven way. I'll show you that in just a minute. So the sequence in which things move is random. The point at which you get to move Task Force 58 is also random. But overlaid on that, as I said, are the 4 action phases of 20 minutes each. And that is when the air stuff is done. So you get to do air operations on your carriers, which we will talk about at some length, 4 times a turn. You get to move your missions 4 times a turn, and the Japanese get to move 4 times a turn. So the air is on a much shorter cycle than the naval stuff is, of course, because ships move a lot faster than planes. The first thing we do in each game turn is bring in new Japanese forces, which has already been done here. But basically, this is a simple random system. Each turn, you compute the number of forces you're going to bring in. There are 20 force counters altogether. And the rule is that you bring in 1/3 of however many are not in play at that time. So on the first game turn, you have all 20 are not yet in play. So 1/3 of that, rounding down, is 6. And that's why we have 6 force counters in play at the start. And then the arrival of each one is determined randomly. There are 4 different arrival zones, and if you look closely, they're color coded. So this is one zone here, this is another zone here, this is another zone here, and then we have a zone down here. So using the Japanese arrival table up here, you first determine which zone. So let me see if I can zoom in on that just a little bit. Okay, so there we go. There's the table. So if you rolled a 2, for example, let's say we're placing force A here. Okay, the way we might have got there is we roll, say, a 2, and that determines it's zone 1. Okay, this is zone 1. And then there are conveniently 10 different arrival circles in each zone. So you simply roll the die again, and that determines which one. So in this particular case, force A is on number 2. So that would mean we had rolled a 2 for the second die roll. The way it works is there's a greater chance of coming in these 2 middle zones than on either of the flank zones, because that is where the Japanese were most likely to come from. This is the direction of the Philippine Islands, basically over here, and Indonesia, which is where most of their sources of oil were at this point in the war. But there is definitely the possibility that you may get flanked by somebody coming in up here or up here. That's definitely something that can happen. And what the Japanese will try to do, if you look at the mission movement compasses, is they're basically going to try to head for this zone over here, this dark zone, which is the invasion zone. And if the Japanese are able to get actual forces, be they surface or certainly carrier, but even surface, to this zone and off the map, that's going to be bad for you for victory, because that will mean that those forces can interfere with the invasion that was ongoing of Saipan. So a big mission for you in the game is to prevent that from happening. And historically, as you may know, Admiral Spruance, who was the overall American commander here, was quite concerned about that possibility and fought the first day of the battle in a rather unorthodox way in terms of carrier fighting, so as to prevent being flanked and have an end run like that happen. He was very concerned about that. Anyway, so the next thing we do, having brought forces in, is we make up our activation cup. And this is the cup of chits that is going to determine the sequence for the turn. So I will just show you a little bit of how this is done in Vassal, and so you can understand the makeup of the chit. So we get 1 chit for each Japanese force that is in play. I'll come to what butais are, by the way, in a little while. That's a special type of force that isn't in the game at the start. So right now, for example, we have forces A, B, C, D, E, and F in play, the first 6. So we would put those 6 chits into the cup. So you can just pick a chit like this, and then you, in Vassal, just drag like that, and bam, there you go. It's in the cup. There are a couple of coffee cups that get used. If you have favorite coffee cups, a lovely image of a United States Navy coffee cup was used. I have a couple of favorite coffee cups that have similar art to that. Yeah, it's a chance to use a couple of favorite coffee cups to hold different chits. Activation being one of them, another one being the level 1 forces. Then, in addition to however many force chits there are, we also put one in for Guam, which is the possibility of an air raid from Guam. And we put one in for Iwo Jima, which is the possibility of an air raid from Iwo Jima. So now we're up to 8 chits in the cup if we had put them all in. In addition, we put one in for US move. Okay, so there we go. So that's 9. And then one for the US submarines, to have a number of chits that is divisible by 4, so everything works out neatly. So what we have are a couple of no-op chips, which we add in just to make up numbers and also to create some uncertainty. So we'll put those in as well. Now we have a total of 12 chits in the cup. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. So in each of the action phases, we will draw 3 chits. So every forces chit will be drawn at some point in one action phase. So will the US subs chit. It'll be drawn once. The US move chit, it'll be drawn once. So at the time those chits are drawn, those naval forces get to act. So in the case of the US, when the subs chit is drawn, that means you get to attempt to find enemy forces with your submarines and either shadow them or attack them. shadowing them does not mean that they are fully detected in the sense they would be for airstrikes. It just gives you a benefit if you do later try to detect them with air search, and that represents the rather poor coordination that I talked about earlier. Task Force 58 can move when you get the US move chit if you wish to move it. And then each time the Japanese chit is drawn, let's say the Force A chit is drawn, that means Force A gets to do two things. First, we check to see if it launches an air raid. And I'll talk a whole lot more about that. And then it also gets to move in accordance with either these mission movement compasses that we talked about or tactically in response to Task Force 58. So that's basically how that works. By the way, I use the term launch an air raid, and I'm going to say something that I'll probably repeat a few more times here in the broadcast, and I apologize for, if I say it too many times. But when you get an air raid from a force, that represents you detecting an air raid. It doesn't represent the air raid actually taking off. In other words, you don't find out about the air raid until it's actually approaching your ships. It was launched sometimes before, and there are quite a few consequences to that fact in the game. Okay, so let's assume we drew the A chit to begin with. So Force A is going to get to do something. And I'm going to assume for the moment it doesn't launch an air raid because I want to talk about air raids later. So we would just use this mission movement compass here. And that means we would roll the die. And on a 1 through 4, which I hope you can read even though it's upside down, it would move 1 hex this way. On a 5 through 7, it would move 1 hex this way. And on an 8 through 10, it would move 1 hex this way. This red line, by the way, is a different red line. It's used to determine some other movement stuff. It's not a boundary to the zone. These dashed lines that you see here, those are the different mission movement zones. Actually, I'm sorry. In here, it is actually a boundary to a zone. So forgive me. That what I just said is wrong about the red line. That's actually a mistake. That it is a boundary to a zone. So if we were to move over here, we would be in a different zone, and then the next turn we'd be covered by this compass. Okay, very good. So let's assume that we get a 5 through 7, and we would move this way. And in the other way, in the same way, these other forces will probably move, and I'm just going to move them in what might be a typical sort of movement here for some possible die rolls. We'll just move these guys along like that. And again, I'm not showing you a complete game here, so I'll go ahead and move them for a second turn of movement, which would be a separate die roll. Of course, they might move the same way, might move differently. You don't know about that, but they will continue to approach like this. So if you look at the way the die rolls play out, you look at the way the zones are structured, you can see basically the Japanese are going to advance, like I said, trying to get into the invasion zone unless you go there to stop them. But if Task Force 58 shows up, then at some point they start responding to Task Force 58 instead, and there are some different rules for that, which we will talk about. Okay, so after two full turns, 2 game turns worth of movement, the board might look like this in terms of these initial 6 forces. After 2 turns, there would also be a few more forces in play, and the US might have chosen to move these subs also. I'm going to not do that right now because, again, I'm not playing a full game. I'm just showing you how some of the subsystems of the game work. What there would have been is a whole lot of air activity. And that is the next thing that I would like to talk about is how we do some of the air stuff, because that's obviously very, very critically important part of the game. So next we'll talk about U.S. air missions and how U.S. aircraft operate in missions. And there are 2 basic types of missions. There's intercept and strike. Search is separate. That's a separate thing. But intercept is fighters, the F-6F, all the fighters are F-6Fs in this battle, who are attempting to find and destroy Japanese aircraft. Strike is generally a combination of F-6F and the various attack plane types, which are trying to attack and destroy Japanese ships. So to make an air mission, the first thing you need is planes ready on the deck. And this topmost row here of your carrier displays in each of the task group boxes is the ready portion of the flight deck. Let's just see if we can zoom in on that a little bit so you can see it more clearly. So this is task group 58.1. You can see it has its aircraft. And the top box here is the ready, flight deck ready. Okay, so these planes are fueled and armed and ready for takeoff, and they can be launched. If the carrier is attacked while these aircraft are in this situation, that's very bad for you. There are brutal die roll modifiers. So often a big decision you face in the game, and of course I'm not trying to teach you the strategy of the game here, just the rules, but you probably don't need me to tell you that a big part of the strategy of the game is deciding how you're going to use your flight deck. Do you want to have a strike ready to go? Do you want to have more aircraft warmed up, ready to join intercepts? Or do you want to clear things off to prepare for an attack so you're not vulnerable? Then the box right below here is servicing. Those are aircraft that are being fueled and armed or defueled and de-armed. And then down below here is the hangar deck where all the aircraft are stored. Below that is the landing box. So flight deck landing, those are aircraft that have just landed but haven't been struck below yet for servicing. So there is a cycle they have to go through. When they come in and land, they go down to the hangar, then they go through servicing, then they can go back to the flight deck, and each of those takes one action phase. It takes a total of about 4 action phases to cycle through that. We'll look at that in a little more detail in just a minute. But as far as how we do missions, we have here a F6F ready on each of the decks of our carriers. And I should note, by the way, that these two carriers over here, I didn't put the carrier pieces out. Sorry about that. But these two are actually CVs, Essex class CVs, whereas these two are CVLs, so light carriers. One thing you'll find out in this game is how much less efficient the CVLs were. That was really a stopgap program just to get some more flight decks into the Pacific as soon as possible. The Navy had some light cruiser hulls that it was working on and decided to build them all with flight decks on top. It was an expedient just to get more ships out there, but they were far, far less efficient than the purpose-built Essex class carriers, and that really comes out in the game. So this one unit is all we can have ready here. Here we get two, and there's similar limits to how much they can do in the other categories as well. Okay, so we have some planes ready on the deck. Let's zoom back out again. There we go. So what we will do is we will just drag some F4Fs. Let's say I want to launch all of them. Okay, these 4 planes that I have. So we will go ahead and put this up here in the Air Mission 8 box, and I've got that one ready too. I'll launch that, and I'll launch that. So there we go. There's a specific order to the different carrier air operations that you can do, and the order is important. Okay, but launch is the first one. So here we are. Now in this Vassal module, there's some nice little properties here. This little counter here lets us choose what type of mission we're going to have. And this, as I said, is going to be an intercept mission. So there we go. We have an intercept. We get to place that on the map. Okay, there's our marker. Good. I just lost track of it there for a minute. So let us put it on Task Force 58 because it launches into the same hex. So there it is. And then we can give it a number. The counters that come with the game have numbers already, but in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to set that number. So that's going to be intercept number 8. Good. So we have an air mission. You notice there are 2 types of air missions. There are 8 different tracks, Air Mission 1 through Air Mission 8. So you can have a total of 8 air missions in play, and that is a design limit. There was a limit to how much the air controllers could actually handle. That's definitely a design limit. So if you have 6 intercept missions out, for example, that's only 2 missions left that you could use for strikes. So that's a bit of a choice as to how it amounts to how you're going to use your frequencies on your airwaves, as well as how you're going to use your flight decks and your aircraft and your pilots and lots of other things. But it is definitely something to think about. Now, one other thing that we need to do is put a fuel marker in play, and we can do that here. Place fuel marker. Bam, there we have a fuel marker. And we're just going to drag this over to the 4 box. And I want to just zoom in on that to make sure we have the right side up here. Just to make sure of that, I think we do, but let's be sure. Yeah, it says plus 10. So the fuel markers are printed plus 10 on one side, plus 0 on the other side. So initially, they're going to have an endurance. I actually should have put them up here in the 16 box. Sorry about that, because the F6Fs have endurance of 16. As the air units move around, you expend fuel. So let's talk about that just a little bit. every action phase that your mission is up in the air, it has to use at least 1 point of fuel. So at this moment, this intercept is effectively patrolling over top of the carriers. If it just sits there and doesn't move, then in every action phase, it'll use 1, because of course aircraft don't stand still in the air. They always burn fuel. Now you can move your air mission up to 2 hexes per air movement segment, which is the part of the action phase when you move your aircraft. The first hex that you move counts as 1 fuel point. So if I just wanted to, let me do the double click on that. So there we go. If I just wanted to move this 1 hex, for example, that would cost 1 fuel point. I would take the 16 down to 15. If I want to move it a second hex, that costs either 1 or 2 additional fuel points. You roll the die and it's a 50% chance. So on a 1 through 5, that whole move of 2 hexes is going to cost me 2 fuel points. But if I happen to roll a 6 through 10, it would cost me 3 fuel points. So moving around fast can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. In addition to engaging combat costs an air mission 3 fuel points. Every time you engage in combat, it sucks down 3. And these came from actual performance charts that it's amazing what you can find on the internet. But these were actually flight test performance charts from World War II for these different types of aircraft. It's amazing how their fuel consumption actually increases when they're being driven at maximum performance as opposed to the most fuel efficient performance. So that is how you move. Now, what you might ask, at some point, if we keep moving down like this, we are going to hit 0. So we're plus 10, 15, 14, 13. We go down here, that's 10. And then the next fuel point we take out will be 9. And we can, there we go. So now we're down to 9, 8, so on. Eventually, we're going to hit 0. And what happens then is you become fuel critical, and you put a different marker on, which is the fuel critical marker. So additional fuel that you spend will now make you more and more fuel critical 1, 2, 3, which represent increasingly desperate states of fuel, all the way up to 6. If you hit 7, it's in red for a reason. If you become fuel critical 7, your plane's eliminated right away. It drops into the ocean. Now, what happens if you become fuel critical 1 through 6? What happens then is you have to roll, and there's a chart for it, for what is called safe landing. And the worse your fuel critical state, the less likely it is that you land safely. So that represents either splashing before you get back to the carrier, which happened a lot in this battle, or some kind of accident when you hit the carrier, which could also happen. If planes were low on fuel, they wouldn't always be able to do the correct approach, or they might have to try to land when their approach wasn't the best, all of these things. But mainly it represents just plain running out of fuel, which, as I said, a lot of U.S. aircraft did in this battle. Fortunately, the United States was very good at rescuing pilots and placed a very high priority on that. So most of the aviators were rescued. A very small number of aviators actually died in the ocean as a result of fuel shortages, which is, of course, great to know. The aircraft, of course, were lost, but at this point, the U.S. didn't really care about the aircraft. We were producing so many aircraft that part didn't matter. It was the pilots who mattered. As we said, missions can be intercept or they can be air strikes. If it's an air strike, then it will always have at least some attack aircraft. So the SB-2Cs or the TBFs, they're formed exactly the same way. Important rule about airstrikes, though, is an airstrike can only go more than 2 hexes from Task Force 58 if it has a target. And a Japanese force can only be a target of an airstrike if you have detected it. We'll talk about how you do detection later. So you cannot send airstrikes out speculatively, just in the hope that you might be able to detect something. But you can, if you want. There are 2 things you can usefully do with them. One is you can just have them circle around your Task Force 58, burning fuel, so that they're not sitting there on your deck being vulnerable. Or you can have them head over to Guam. And what actually happened in this battle was that the U.S. had a lot of strike planes ready on the first day. When the first Japanese raids were detected, they flew them all off so as to clear the flight decks. And then The strikes motored around for a while, burning gas to no real purpose. And then the flight leader basically said, hey, why don't we go dump our ordnance over Guam? And everybody thought that was a splendid idea. So they flew over to Guam and dumped all their ordnance on the Japanese positions in Guam instead of just dumping it in the ocean. It's a pretty good idea to get some kind of fighter coverage over Guam early in the game, by the way, because otherwise there can be a lot of land-based aircraft which show up and they can be a problem. In fact, the comprehensive example in the playbook illustrates what happens if you don't do that. Okay, so we talked about how to be launched. Planes have to be ready on deck. We talked a little bit about how to use this display here. If you want to put some planes in servicing, for example, you just move them like that. There are limits of how many planes you can have in each state. Your flight deck cannot have more than 3 for the CVs and no more than 1 for the CVLs, and that's total. So if I had, for example, this, 1 plane in the landing space and 2 planes in the ready space, that's the full flight deck capacity of this carrier. For the CVLs, you can have 1 in the landing or you can have 1 in the ready. You cannot have both. It's one or the other. Like I said, they're much less efficient. The servicing spaces are allowed to have 2 at a time. Now, an interesting thing about that is if you defuel a plane, so if you have a plane in servicing and you decide to move it back to the hangar, that counts as one of your planes in servicing for that action phase. So you could have 1 remain there and then 1 that you moved away because basically you've used up the capacity to defuel the planes. The reason you would do that is, as I mentioned, there are die roll modifiers, severe die roll modifiers if you're caught with ready aircraft on the deck, pretty severe die roll modifiers if you're caught with aircraft in servicing. That was actually almost as bad as having planes ready on the deck. Then if they're properly stowed in the hangar, which means both that the planes are properly stowed, but also they're not full of gasoline and the bombs have been stowed away, which is, as if you've read the history of the Battle of Midway, you know that was the big issue. The Japanese had bombs and torpedoes all over the place and also a bunch of fueled aircraft. And so 1 American bomb was enough to turn their flagship into an inferno and destroy the ship. Just 1 bomb, because all the rest of it was those ready aircraft. Another important limitation is you cannot both launch and land in the same segment. So you can either use your flight deck for launch or you can use it for landing, not both. And that is because of the geometry of flight decks in this period. If you wanted to launch planes, those planes had to be spotted on the aft half of the deck. So they had a runway space to get off. Well, the aft half of the deck is exactly where planes could land. So you cannot do both. You can either use your flight deck for launching or for landing. Like I said, there's really the 2 most important decisions that you make as a carrier admiral are how do you use your air assets and how do you use your flight decks. Those decisions come at you again and again and again during the game. Okay. So we've talked a little bit now about how the United States aircraft are handled. Let's see a bit about the Japanese aircraft. And if you remember, we moved these Japanese forces through 2 turns of movement. Okay, so this is where they might be as of the beginning of turn 3, these 2 forces. And I'm going to focus here on Force A and Force B. Okay, and let us suppose that the first sequence chit pulled is Force A. Now, there's an algorithm you go through and a reference chart that you can use to explain, just for reference, of how the airstrikes are done. But let me try to unlock the concept of it for you. The basic idea is that you don't know at this point what Force A is. It might have carriers, it might not, it might have nothing. So what you're going to determine is the following. You're first going to determine if this force had carriers. If it did, would those carriers attack me at this point? And that is a function of how far away they are. How likely is it that they would have found you by search? Would their planes have had time to reach you at this point? Because remember, it's not that something gets launched from their flight decks. That's not what we're detecting. We're saying, do we at this point detect incoming aircraft that were launched by that force sometime before? So if it were a carrier force, would it have attacked me? If the answer to that is no, we stop. You don't find out anything more. If the answer to that question is yes, then you ask the question, is this a carrier force? And I put such emphasis on this because that is exactly the opposite of how you might expect that it would be done. You might expect that we'd say, okay, first, is this a carrier force? Okay, if it is, then does it attack me? That would be reasonable. But the thing is, that would then give you information that you should not have as the U.S. Admiral. If you don't see any planes in the sky, you don't see any planes in the sky. And you don't know if that's because there aren't any carriers out there, or because they haven't found you yet, or because the planes haven't reached you yet. I don't want to give you that information. So we first ask the question, would the planes be there if there were carriers? And then we have to ask the question, are there in fact carriers there? So let me pull up the chart that we use for this. So let's assume we're doing force A here, okay? It is a level 0 force. We know nothing about it. The first thing we do is ask whether the commitment level for the scenario has been exceeded. Commitment is a measure of when you can believe that you've found all the Japanese carriers. There were only so many carriers still floating in the Japanese Navy in 1944, fewer after this battle, but there were only so many still floating. So the number of carriers can't be allowed to increase without bound. Eventually, you hit a bound. All the carriers are there. So if all the carriers have been found, then you don't attempt to reveal any additional ones. I should mention, by the way, the game in that connection, the game gives you options of playing with, if you prefer, with only the historical Japanese ships that actually engaged in this battle, or you can use other carriers that might have engaged but didn't. And the most interesting of those, if you're into this time period, and I suspect you are, is the supercarrier Shinano, which in fact, as you know, was sunk on its first mission by the U.S. submarine Archerfish in November of 1944. It didn't make it to this battle, but hey, maybe it could have. And so optionally, you can include Shinano as well as a number of other ships. And then in the final scenario, which is a what if scenario, we actually allow you to bring back the entire Pearl Harbor striking force. And imagine what if it hadn't been sunk at Midway. And you can include those ships as a possibility too, as well as all the aviators that those ships carried. And that makes a significant difference in the game. Things get a lot harder for Task Force 58 in that game. Okay, so we're going to use this chart here, the Japanese air raid generation chart. And this row is for the game turn. Now, I said it's the third game turn, so that's 0810. So the maximum range at which any raid can be launched is 11. We use the term raid for Japanese air attacks and strike for American air attacks just because the rules are so different for the two of them. Again, because you're the U.S. Admiral. That's why we're talking about Japanese air raids, but U.S. air strikes. And this max range here represents how far the planes could have flown. So you see in the 0530 term, we only allow raids out to 5 hexes because that would assume that they had found you probably by a night search, launched the strike in the pre-dawn darkness, as was done at Pearl Harbor, and flown out 5 hexes by the time of this first day turn. By 0810, they've had the chance to fly a lot further, obviously. There are modifiers for the turn. Again, you can see at 0530, the modifier is -3. It's much less likely that the Japanese will launch a strike because they already had to find you to do it. Whereas by 0930, for example, that modifier is 0. They've had plenty of time to find you. And then later on in the day, see by 1850, there's a significant negative modifier again, sorry, right here for that because it's unlikely the Japanese would launch a strike at that time because then they would have to land in the night, and that's a difficult operation, as we know. There are also modifiers for the range. You can see at short range, that modifier becomes quite large, +3, strikes are more likely. Out at the far distant range, 11 and 12, it becomes much less likely, a -3. That represents, of course, the decreased likelihood that the Japanese have found you. If you're 12 hexes away, it's much less likely that they would have found you than if you're within 3 hexes of their force. In this situation for force A, which is 6 hexes away, let's just count that, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 hexes. Okay, so that modifier for turn is going to be -1. The modifier for range is going to be +1. Those will cancel out. And then the rule is simply that if we get a modified die roll of 4 or less, there is no attack. If we get a 5 or more, we do get an attack. Okay, so let's suppose that we roll, say, an 8, and that means we do get an attack. Now, the next thing we would do then is draw a chit, a level 1 chit from the level 1 cup. And let me see if I have that level 1 cup. Here we are. Here's the level 1 cup. Okay, so I mentioned you need to use a couple of coffee cups in this game. Well, here you go. Okay, so there's a second one. And let us suppose that we draw a false contact. Okay, so at that point, then this is not known to be a carrier force. Now, key point, do we take this off the map? No, we do not. We put the false contact chit back there. All we know is that at this time, this didn't launch a strike. It could still turn out to be a carrier force later on. Again, all it means is you didn't see planes in the air. So that's key to understand. Whereas if we are searching, if we are doing aircraft search and we draw a false contact chit, well, that means this really was a false contact. There was nothing there. So at that point, we remove the force from the map and we also remove this false contact chit from the game so that eventually we get down to the ones that are legitimate. Okay, now let us assume then we're going to do this for force B as well. Now force B is further away. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But let's assume we get the good die roll that we need. We draw another chit, and this time we get a level 1 carrier. So it's passed the test. It is potentially launching a strike against us. So let's find out. It is a carrier force, and it has said it wants to launch a strike. So let's take a look again at the chart. The next thing we do is determine the strength. And let me see if I can make this chart a little bit bigger for you so you can see this part. Oh, that's much better. Okay, there we go. There are several different air raid strength charts depending on what level the force is at and what we know about its air strength. Right now, the air strength of this force is unknown. It has no air units in the game. So we're going to use this chart for level 1 to 2 forces. Remember, it's just become a level 1 carrier force. There it is. Okay. It has no known air strength. The air strength is unknown. Okay. I'm sure you're aware of this, but to say something has 0 air strength is very different from saying it has no known air strength. No known means it's not known. It could be anything. It could be very large. So we are going to use this column, and you will see that level 1 carrier simply means it has some sort of carriers. We don't know how many. It could have lots of carriers or it could have just a few. So let us say we get a die roll of 8, okay? The result for 8 is 8/6. That means this thing probably has a number of carriers, certainly not just one. That means it has a first wave of 8 and a second wave of 6. So 2 waves. So at this point, we have airstrikes coming in and we have a real live carrier force. So a couple of things need to happen. One is we are going to take out Japanese air raid markers and we are going to take out a, let's see, a air raid 1 and we're going to put that on the map right there. And then we're going to take out air raid 1B and we're going to put that on the map right there. So these are going to represent the first and second waves. Now there is actually a chart for how far out you detect the first wave, and it's possible to detect them as far out as 5 hexes if you're lucky, okay? Or it's possible that you detect them much closer in. This, what I've illustrated here, I just didn't want to walk you through the chart, but this would be a rather bad outcome for the US. That means you didn't detect them until they were 66 miles away, which is not great performance by 1944. Historically, the US did a lot better than that in the actual battle. And that was a big reason why this battle ended up being called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. So anyway, there we are. We have our first and second wave coming in. Now we need to do something else, which is that we are going to replace this. Yeah, I'm looking for these guys, the butane markers. You know what? I'll just use this. This will be fine. I am going to replace this force. Just going to kind of take it off the map, park it over there. I am going to replace it by this fella here. Okay, so I think this is where it was. All right, there we go. That amorphous force has now been replaced by something called a butai. Little bit of whimsy in using that word, but it is authentic. Butai is a Japanese word meaning force or echelon or element, just some grouping of combat assets. You may know the phrase Kido Butai, which means strike force. That was the word name for the Japanese striking force that attacked Pearl Harbor. So any force that is known to have carriers, we call a butai. Okay, and here's our butai display. This is now butai number 1, so it's represented by the upper left here of this display, this part here. I'm going to grab that level 1 carrier chit and put it right there. So that's what we know about the intelligence of this. And then we also are going to put some air units into the game, representing that airstrike that we actually had. So here's our units. We have naval air points and we have land air points. So these are naval air points. And what we're going to do, I think we can actually assign an air strength to these. So I'm going to set an air strength of 5 for that, okay, just to model the denominations that they come in the game. So there we go. So this is going to be air raid 1. And remember, it had a total strength of 8. So let's do this. Let's set the air strength to be 2. Like I said, let's set the air strength to be 2. There we go. Okay, so that is 7. And now we will just do a 1. So there's a total of 8, as you can see. Now the second wave was 6, so I'm going to go ahead and drag that 1 there. And then I will go ahead and set this again to be 5. Okay, so this is a pretty honking big pair of airstrikes. So now we have these 2 raids. Now you notice, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this butai display here. Here's our aircraft for Air Raid 1. Here's our aircraft for Air Raid 1B. I've put them in the middle here. There are 2 sections. One is fighters, you can see there, and the other is attack. And once we have put these air points on the butai display, they never leave. They never again leave for any reason. So if they successfully complete their mission and return to their ship, then they go on this track, the air raid return track. When they reach that, they do the turnaround track and then go on to the available section of the turnaround track. Let me show you how this works with just one air point. Let's say that this air point survives and it returns to its carrier. Well, the range was 8 hexes away, so it will go here into the return track. The next turn, its force is activated. It will move down here. The turn after that, it will go here. Then it will go through these 2 servicing boxes, and then it will start to become available again for another raid at increasing ranges. Okay, each time the force is activated until eventually it would become available at any range. If it is shot down, and there will be more shot down than will survive, you put it in the lost section. The purpose of this is so that you can easily see later in the game and compute how many air points this force has shown during the game. When we search this force, okay, right now it's a level 1 force, but when we search it, we will contact it, and then it will become a level 2 force. And when it's level 2, we start to know approximately how many carriers it has. That outcome will be heavily influenced by the number of air points it has revealed. This force has revealed 14 air points. That's a lot of aircraft. So it will be very likely that this will become a force with 2 to 3 carriers as opposed to a force with 1 carrier. So that way, as I said, what happens in the increasing information you get is consistent with the outcomes that have happened in the game. A force that has launched a big strike against you will become a force that has more carriers. If it's launched only a small strike, then it will become much more likely to have just one carrier. So that's very important in the operation of the game. Okay, let's take this away for a moment. I'm going to put this just off to the side like that because we're going to need it. Now, in the sequence of play, these raids were placed. They don't move in the action phase in which they were placed. The reason being that they have already moved in that action phase. In other words, they were probably back here, they flew into range, and you detected them at that point. So the next thing that happens is you get to move. Well, we are going to do, we are going to just fly out there. And let's not fly all of Task Force 58 out there, huh? Let's just fly the planes out. Okay, there we go. So we have flown out 2 hexes. And if you remember, we said, okay, our fuel started at 16. It will cost us at least 2 to do that. Let's suppose we don't get the die roll we want. That drops down to 13, okay? And now we're going to engage in combat, intercept combat, so that will cost us 3 more points of fuel. Down we go. So you see how fast fuel gets sucked down. We've already used more than a third of the fuel that the planes took off with. But now we're going to do air-to-air combat. So at this point, since we have actually contacted the raid, we get to find out how many escorts it has and how many attack planes it has. So let me bring the charts back, okay? And there is a chart for that. There's quite a few charts in the game, but they are grouped, and all the rules, whenever they refer to a chart, the rules always tell you what card it's on. So like card 2 front, you see it's labeled here. And then every chart has a reference to the rule that describes it. So we've tried to make it as easy as possible to go in direction between the rulebook and the charts. So this is the escort fighter table. Now the raid size is 8 because the first wave by itself is considered to be a separate raid. You can see that we roll a die and we get either 1 or 2 points of escort. So let's assume we get 2. Okay, so that means there will be 6 points of attack planes and 2 points of fighters. So now you see we've put those in that box. The second wave we don't know yet. We haven't contacted that. Now we have 4 planes that we're engaging with. So let's bring out the charts again and let's get the air-to-air combat chart. That's one that you're going to use quite a bit. And you will notice there are separate air-to-air combat charts for the US firing and for the Japanese firing, representing definitely the different qualities of the aircraft, the different qualities of the pilots, but also the fact that the US air units and the Japanese air points represent different numbers of aircraft. Yeah, it was just simpler to do a separate chart. So we have to allocate at least one of our F6Fs against these escorts. The rule is 1 point, you have to allocate at least 1 air unit for every 2 points of escort. So we will allocate just 1. And then we want to shoot at these guys with our other 3, like this. That's how I want to do it as the player anyway. How you do it is up to you, but that's how I'm going to do it. So let's bring the chart up again. So here's the US air-to-air combat table. So first we're going to do our 1 unit firing at these guys. We do it on the 1 column. We will notice that if the target is a fighter, then we have to subtract 1 from our die roll. We also subtract 1 from our die roll against everybody in that Great Battle of the Pacific scenario that I talked about. That's the one where you get to bring back the ghost ships from Midway, because we presume that they have the pre-war aviators on board, and that just makes an enormous difference. There are some other modifiers. If your firing unit is fuel critical, it's a lot less likely to hit anything because it can't go full throttle. And then if the target is land aircraft, you are more likely to hit something, especially if you're in Guam and a raid is being launched at that moment. You can catch them as they're coming up off the deck. So anyway, let us suppose, just for illustration, that we do get the die roll we want. And let's say we get what the heck? Let's say we get a 10. Well, that would be, so we have to subtract 1, so that becomes a 9. So we hit one of these guys. So let me just see if I can reduce that by 1. So there we go. And then I would need another unit let's bring up the units here. And there's naval air. And I'm going to set an air strength to 1. Okay. I'm getting the hang of this here. This is actually a great Vassal Macho. Kevin Conway did a super job on this. I'm just not very talented with it. So there you see we put 1 in the lost category. Now those 2 are going to get to shoot back at us. So let's bring the chart back up. So here on the Japanese chart, there are two points firing. And then there are various modifiers. As you see, another modifier for that Great Battle of the Pacific scenario, better pilots. This modifier here, +2 when firing against attack planes with no escorts, that's a pretty big deal. You always want to make sure you have some escort for your strikes. But let's assume that the Japanese don't get a great die roll and they don't do any damage to us, okay? So now let's go down to the attack against the strike planes. Now this is just us shooting at the strike planes. They don't shoot back at us. We have 3 here. So we're going to go on the 3 column. And let's suppose we get a 5, okay? That will take out one of these guys. So now 2 have been shot down. All right, great. So what would happen then, obviously, other parts of the action phase and so forth, but in the next action phase, it's the Japanese turn to move. They move 2 hexes per turn. So this raid will move to right there, and then this raid will move to right there. Now, undoubtedly, there would be, well, probably, let me say, not undoubtedly, but probably, you might have had some more fighters ready on your carriers to launch at this point. So a common tactic, since as you can see, planes consume fuel rather rapidly in the air, you cannot have your planes up all the time. To intercept, you need to make decisions about how many you're going to have in the air and how many you're going to have ready on the deck, and you can reinforce with an additional intercept mission when necessary. Okay, so let's assume that this raid gets through, and just for illustration, here we are, Task Force 58, and the raid has contacted Task Force 58. It seems to want to sit under Task Force 58. Well, that's fine, whatever. Let's assume it got through, and it has all 5 of those naval air points still present, okay, which wouldn't be a great outcome. Then an unlikely outcome, but let's suppose it had that just for illustration. The next thing you would do is fire anti-aircraft. And let's find the anti-aircraft chart. You have to determine for the Japanese when the raid comes in what they're going to do with respect to the battle line. Battle line was Task Force 58.7. It was a powerful force of battleships and supporting ships which acted in a screening role in this battle. Basically, it was positioned in the direction the Japanese were likely to come from, and Admiral Mitcher had this pretty well worked out. So the Japanese had to fly over battle line, and a number of the Japanese pilots, either for whatever reason, possibly that they weren't as well trained as the pre-war pilots, or possibly for other reasons, diverted from their mission of attacking the carriers and attacked battle line. There were actually quite a few attacks made and hits inflicted on the battleships, which of course would have been disappointing to the Japanese admiral because from his point of view, the battleships were not the target, the carriers were. So anyway, when a raid comes in, you roll on this table, the Japanese action versus battle line. And there are 3 possible outcomes. One is that the entire raid diverts and attacks the battle line. Another is that it overflies the battle line and it gets fired at just by the battleships and at half value. And a third is that it avoids battle line altogether and cleverly flies around it, and battle line does not contribute. This is a pretty significant die roll. And I guess I don't need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. This is a luck heavy game. And just as Carrier was a luck heavy game. And that is the way it was, folks. I mean, that represents the truth of carrier fighting. One bomb hit destroyed the Japanese flagship at Midway. If that one pilot misses his aim and happens to put his bomb in the ocean instead of perfectly placed right in the center of the flight deck, that ship survives that attack. Let's assume we get the middle outcome and the battleships get to engage at half value. Well, half of battle line's anti-aircraft value is 65. So let's find the anti-aircraft fire table. There it is. We're firing on the 60 column. And these results are aborted and eliminated. So if we got, say, the middle result here, 5, that would mean 1 unit aborted, 1 unit eliminated. Eliminated, of course, means shot down. Aborted means it doesn't finish its bomb run, but it does get to fly back to its carrier. So if that were our outcome, we would now be down to 3 naval air points surviving. We had 5, 1 aborted, 1 eliminated. Now we're down to 3. And that was just from battle line. So the next thing that gets to happen is the task group itself gets to fire its anti-aircraft, which we have to choose which task group we're attacking. We make that choice randomly. Let us suppose we chose task group 58.1. That will put us in the 80 column. If you total up all their ships, their anti-aircraft is 82, I believe. Let's suppose we don't get a good roll and we get just a 1, okay? It's kind of a lousy roll, which will abort 1 and not destroy any. Well, we were down to 3. We've aborted 1. Now we're down to 2. So now somebody actually gets to drop a bomb, okay? And each Japanese naval air point attacks with 4. So their total attack value will be 8. This is a 2-step process. You determine how many die rolls you get to make, and then you actually determine how many hits there are. We get what this 1 plus 1 means is we make 1 attack die roll and we add 1 to it. Down on this table, you can see it ranges from 0 all the way up to 5. Okay, so if we were to roll, say, a 10 here, which is the worst outcome for us, we said we were adding 1 from that outcome. That 10 would become an 11, and here we are, 5 hits. So that would inflict 5 hits on one of our carriers, which would do attendant damage to the aircraft and would also probably start a fire. There are some rules for that. Okay, so that is basically how combat is done. It's how air-to-air combat is done, how air-to-surface combat is done. That's basically what you need to know about that. The last point I wanted to talk about, just to show you how this works, is search. Search is done obviously with your air units, and it is not an air mission. It's something you do separately. You attend to search once per game turn, but at a time that you choose. So in one of your 4 action phases, you get to have a search segment, but you choose which phase it is. It can be any one of the 4. It's not driven by die roll. It's driven by you. And when you launch a plane on search, you actually put it on the map and you fly it out initially 2 hexes, and you can fly it in any direction you want, okay? And so 2 hexes the first time, then the next time it's your search segment, you move it 2 hexes more, and then the next time it's your search segment, you move it 2 hexes more, okay? And that represents the time that the plane can fly during an entire game turn when it's flying rather economically, trying to conserve fuel. If it were flying at max speed, of course, it wouldn't have that much range. Now, there is a display here, which has gotten some interesting comment online already. This is the air search display, okay? And basically, this tells you which which of these Japanese forces a particular search plane can try to see. So if this guy were to fly out here, for example, if you worked the display, you would find out that basically it would be able to detect this force, and now not that force, probably just these 2. Now, if I were to launch a search right now, of course, I would want to fly out towards butai number 1 and detect that. But the problem is, of course, if you wait until these are revealed, then they will have attacked you already. And the idea is to find them before they attack you. So if we had launched searches at dawn, we would have moved them 2 hexes the first time, 2 hexes the second time, and then on this turn, we would move them 2 more hexes. They'd move out to there, which is the maximum range of their search. And this guy we would have a chance to detect him. So let's see how that works, just for fun, because we know he's a butai, so something interesting will probably happen. Let's bring our charts and tables out. So the most important factor in this is going to be the range to the target, okay? And that range was 8 hexes. So at a range of 8 or 9 hexes, we're subtracting 1, okay? So we roll, we consult the table. Now the outcomes range from nothing. So if we rolled a 3, for example, we get nothing, or a 4 for that matter. Question mark means approximate location, then there's location, and then there's spotting. And then There's also the big casino, which is spotting and chit number one. So if we rolled an 8, for example, we would get spotted and chit plus one. What does that mean? Spotted means it becomes spotted, which is the best condition of detection. So both spotted, located, and approximately located are all detected, but spotted is the best. And the reason spotted is the best is that every time a Japanese force moves one, you downgrade. It moves every time its activation chit is drawn. It downgrades to the next lower level. So if it was approximately located, it becomes not detected, it becomes undetected. If it was located, it becomes approximately. If it was spotted, it becomes located. The detection state is going to factor into how likely it is for your strikes to contact that force. When you fly a strike out to a force, you have to roll a die to determine if your strike actually finds that force. And the more current your detection information is, the more likely you are to succeed. Range is a factor in that as well. So, in other words, intelligence is perishable. But as I say, if we get the best possible roll here, we are spotted and we get a chit plus one. And what that means is that the intelligence level of this force will go up one. So it was at intelligence level one, it will now be at intelligence level two. And that means we will know more about it than we did before. Let me see if I've got the Butai display handy. I might not. So here we are with a level 1 chit. I'm just going to say replace that with a level 2 marker so you can see what they're like, okay? And that would be a possible outcome from this one, but not likely. It would probably be that we got 2 to 3 CVs for this one, and that's because of how many aircraft it showed us. So there are tables for that where you use the current intelligence level and also the number of aircraft as a modifier and determine the new intelligence level. A more likely outcome, as I said, because this showed us so many aircraft, would be that you get 2 to 3 CVs. If you go up to level 3, then you get more specific information. And if you go up to level 4, then you actually find out what the carriers are. You actually draw carriers from a cup. Another cup, sorry, you need another coffee cup, and put those on the butai. Typically, that happens when a strike contact. That's usually when you get up to level 4. But in theory, it could be done just by repeatedly searching it. So that's the other important thing in the game, which is search. There are some simple rules for submarines, but I'm not going to go over those. I've taken enough of your time. Just know that submarines can try to attack, and if they do try to attack, then there's a risk of anti-submarine attack against them. So you may lose the submarine, or the Japanese may lose a carrier, or both. Historically, as the U.S. subs had a lot of success in this battle. There are, as I said, 9 scenarios to the game, 5 learning scenarios and 4 standard scenarios. 2 of the standard scenarios are the historical battle, the first and the second day. Then there is a what if scenario called the Burke-Thatch plan. And in that one, the United States starts split up. 2 task groups fairly far to the west of Saipan, trying to chase after a possible Japanese contact. So you get 2 of them out here, and then the other 2 are back by Saipan. So your forces start split up. That's a very interesting one to play, suggested by our ace playtester, John Burt. And then, as I said, the Great Carrier Battle of the Pacific, wherein we presume that the Japanese never did the Midway operation, and that they instead adopted a defensive strategy in 1942, which they were considering, and saved their carriers. And so you have the whole Pearl Harbor striking force in the game potentially to fight you, and you fight the big carrier battle of the entire war here off of Saipan. In all of these, the victory conditions require you to do more than the U.S. did historically. As you may know, the historical outcome was the U.S. shot down a massive number of aircraft, successfully screened Saipan, sank 1 carrier attacked by aircraft, and then 2 other carriers were sunk by submarines, which was sort of a lucky, very, very lucky from the U.S. point of view. And it can happen in the game, but it's extremely lucky. We regard that outcome as a long shot, not as the norm. But to get an actual victory in game terms, you need to do better than that. You need to do essentially what was done at Leyte Gulf and wipe the table, clean the table. That's to make it more challenging. What was accomplished historically off Saipan was absolutely a win from the point of view of the United States accomplishing its mission. But we don't want to credit you with a win for that in game terms because the U.S. Navy is so powerful at this point. We want to demand that you do more to make it a challenging play experience. And of course, it's your play experience. You can set the victory conditions however you want, but that's how I set them. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say here in this Learn to Play. I do refer you to the playbook with the comprehensive example, also the learning scenarios, encourage you to go through them and then enjoy the game from there. So thank you so much for your interest in this game. If you have questions online, I encourage you to post those to Consim World or to Board Game Geek. I look at those regularly, and so does the playtest team, and we're happy to answer your questions, and we look forward to your comments as well. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it.